Hello again, hope you're all okay and you're all well. Fifth week of lockdown, I think. Hope you're staying safe, you're staying home and looking after each other. Hope you're enjoying this book. I'm going to read chapters 9, 10 and 11 today. They're quite short chapters, so I thought I'd do a few chapters in a row and then I'll set you a writing task at the end of chapter 11. So far in the story, Jim has managed to escape the workhouse. That's how he left it. Hopefully you did your last piece of writing about whether you think he should or shouldn't leave and explain what the dangers are of either decision. So now we'll find out what's going to happen to him. So chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called The Jaw of the Iron Dog. Jim knew one thing for sure. He must keep away from policemen. If they see me, they'll send me back, he thought. He remembered the white-faced boys in the yard. But I'll run away again as soon as I get a chance. Somewhere in his head was a thought of finding Rosie again. She had been his mother's friend. Maybe if he found her, he would find Emily and Lizzie too. But London was a huge, throbbing, noisy place. He had no idea which way to go. The shops were still open and were still busy, and the streets were full of traders carrying trays of fish and fruit, shouting out their wares. A woman was selling coffee from a handcart. The smell of it reminded him of that morning in the kitchen of the big house, when Rosie had given his mother some of his lordship's coffee to drink. The night noises of the street baffled Jim. He had grown used to the drowning quiet of the workhouse and the distant midnight wails of the mad people. It seemed as if no one here wanted to sleep. He reckoned it was probably safer where there were many people around. Lots of boys about his age were dodging about from one side of the street to the other, in and out of the light of the lamps. It was easy to pretend to be one of them. Soon he stopped to rest against a shop wall, leaning next to another boy. He slid his hand into his pocket for a bit of his supper cheese. The boy looked at him, and Jim stuffed the cheese into his mouth before he had a chance to grab it. "You from the workhouse?" the boy asked him. Jim shook his head. "Bet you are. Them's workhouse clothes, them are." The boy was dressed in tattered trousers and a torn, thin jacket, but the cap on his head was the same as Jim's. Before Jim could speak, the boy snatched up a broom that was propped beside and darted out to stand beside a man in a top hat and long coat. "Clear the road for you, sir," he said, and when the man nodded, the boy stepped out in front of him, brushing a pathway amongst the slush. The man tossed him a coin without looking at him. Jim ran after the boy. "Give us your clothes and you can have mine," he offered. The boy laughed at him, not lightly. He darted off with his broom across his shoulders. There was a sudden cackle of voices behind Jim. A woman selling pickled salmon was being shouted at by another woman with a tray of eels around her waist. Onlookers were joining in and bearing down on them. Their tall hats visible over their heads were two policemen. Jim put his head down and ran. Soon he realised that he was out of the busy area and that he was running through quiet streets without shops. The roads were wider here and the houses grand. They began to look familiar, and yet it was impossible to tell one from another. He came to a dark square that was full of skinny trees. In the middle of it was a fountain, and, as if he looked through a window into his memory, he knew he had been here before. He sat down on the fountain steps. He had sat here on his last journey when his mother had stopped to drink. He had troweled his hands in the water. A bit further back, he thought, there should be a statue of a man on a horse. He made himself stand up, hardly daring to look. There it was, the very statue. They had stopped there too. She had leaned against the statue, and he had seen the fountain and helped her across to it. She had been so weak then, she could have been a little child. He remembered how helpless and frightened he had felt, and that had been over a year ago. He could hardly believe it had been a whole year since his mother had died. Emily and Lizzie didn't even know. All these things were just as they had been then, the man on the horse and the fountain and the big houses. Only this time, Mother wasn't there. He walked slowly up to the statue. 3 streets led away from it. 3 long, tree-lined streets, and one of them was a street where Rosie worked. If he found Rosie, he would find Emily and Lizzie again. He began to run. The houses all looked the same. They all had black railings and little flights of steps going up to the main door, and a little flight leading down to the servants' quarters. Must he knock on every door in every street until he found the right one? He ran up the first street, then came back and tried the second. A sound caught his attention and he looked around. Hanging from the window of one of the kitchens was a tiny cage. A finch with just enough room to move hopped from stand to floor and stand again, whistling out loud for a companion. Jim had heard that before. He was in the right street, and somewhere a long way up it was the house he was searching for. By the time he stopped, he knew exactly what to look out for. He remembered. When his mother had sunk down on the steps and Lizzie had looked up at the grand house and asked if that was where they were going to live, he had seen something that made him hope it wasn't. On the side of the step there had been a metal boot scraper in the shape of a dog's head with a wide, vicious mouth. He remembered thinking then that if he had put his foot inside the mouth, the metal teeth would have come clashing together and pinned him there for good. He ran from side to side of the street looking for it, and at last there it was. He had found it. The house upstairs was in darkness, but down in the basement window was the soft glow of a candle. He tumbled down the steps, tripping himself up on his big boots, and fell against the door. "Emily! Emily!" he shouted out. Before he could raise his fist to hammer on the door, it was pulled open, and he staggered against a girl. Chapter 10. Lame Betsy. "We don't give to beggars," the girl said, trying to edge him out of the door again with her knee. "I'm looking for Emily." "Emily? There's no Emily here." "Emily Jarvis. She helps Rosie out in the kitchen." "Rosie? Who's she?" "You must know Rosie. Rosie, she's got big arms, and she don't like making bread." The girl burst out laughing and looked over her shoulder at a woman who was sewing by the table. "Hear that?" she said. "There's no one here who doesn't like making bread, is there?" She laughed again, and the other woman laughed back in a mocking sort of way. Jim peered past the girl. Surely it was the right kitchen. It had to be. "You'll have to go, Sonny," the girl said. "You stooped round here for long enough, I reckon." "There was a lady with black crinkly dress," Jim said, "called Judd. She'll remember." "Judd?" the other woman said. She put her sewing down. "She was the last housekeeper. She was sent away. And there's another woman too, the cook. I got her job. They were found hiding some street children in the kitchen, and his lordship dismissed them." "They were my sisters," said Jim. The drumming in his head was so loud he could hardly hear his own voice. "Emily and Lizzie, please, miss. Where are they? Where's Rosie?" The cook stood up and came to the doorway. She stood with her arms folded, frowning at Jim. Her face softened when she saw him in the light. "Are they workhouse clothes?" she asked. "Please don't send me back there," Jim begged. "I wouldn't send my worst enemy there," the cook said. "You go off to bed," she said to the girl. "I'll put him on his way." The girl, who seemed to think it was all a fine joke, tweaked Jim's cap over his eye and took her candle up the side stairs that led to the servants' quarters. The cook drew Jim in and told him to sit by the fire. "Lucky for you," she said, "his lordship's away for the night. If he was here, you wouldn't set foot over this doorstep, or we'd all be off to the workhouse. And lucky for you, I've decided to stay up and get this sewing done. And don't think you can pinch anything." Jim shook his head, afraid to speak. "Don't you dare move from that spot." She put her glasses on the end of her nose and glared at Jim as he squirmed on the chair. The heat from the kitchen made him drowsy. He slid his hand into his pocket and felt for the last bit of his cheese. It had gone, and he knew that the boy sweeping the road had pinched it. He tipped the last few breadcrumbs into the palm of one hand. Without saying anything, the woman put down her sewing and ladled some stew from the big pot on the hearth. She pushed the bowlful in front of him and winked without smiling, and Jim did his best to wink back. He ate in silence, and she sewed in silence, frowning at her needle as she rethreaded it, glancing at Jim over the top of her glasses from time to time. Gradually, Jim sank asleep. Sometimes, during the night, he woke up and heard a little soft purring sound, and knew that the cook was snoring into a pile of sewing, but then she'd wake up with a snort, and Jim would drift away again. And at last, they were both startled out of their sleep by a sharp rapping on the glass, and a voice calling out, "5:30, time to be alive!" And there was the knocker-upper, hobbling past the window in his morning rounds, and Jim and the cook were awake for good. She sent him out to the backyard to fetch in water and sticks, and got the fire going, and a pot of water boiling on the hearth. The girl came downstairs, yawning like a cat, and scratched Jim's head as she passed him. "You still here?" "He's going any minute," the cook said. "Soon as the dairy woman comes on her cart and away, and he's never coming back." "That right?" Jim nodded. He wished they would ask him to stay. He liked the warm kitchen and the winking cook. And most of all, he liked her warm, sweet-smelling bread. If only Emily and Lizzie were here too. This would be a fine place to stay. They heard a bell ringing out on the street, and the cook picked up a couple of jugs. "Here's Lame Betsy now." Jim followed her out to the road and up the steps. Lame Betsy was leading a knock-kneed horse from house to house, selling milk from a slopping churn on the cart. "This boy," said the cook, pushing Jim forward, "is looking for Rosie. And if I'm right, she's a friend of yours, Betsy." The dairywoman grunted and pushed her hair under her cap. She ladled milk into the cook's jugs, her breath coming thick and slow. "She's gone down in the world, Rosie Trilling has," she said. "Nice job she had here, and now she's selling whelks for her grandfather, all because of a couple of street kids." "This boy's sisters they were," the cook put in, and Betsy set down the jugs and pushed her hair in her cap again. "Were they now? Doesn't seem right, does it?" she went on. "Just for helping people out like that. Your sisters were they? Didn't look like street kids to me." Her hair floated free again as she shook her head, thick grey strands of it dipping into the milk as she ladled it into its churn. "She was a fine woman, your ma," or so Rosie said. Jim couldn't look at her. He reached up to pat the horse's bony head, and it snorted and pulled back its lips, scaring him. What happened to Emily and Lizzie? He couldn't bring himself to look at lame Betsy. He was frightened about what the answer might be. She shifted her weight from one leg to another. "Don't ask me that, because I don't know the answer," she said. "If you want to climb on the cart, I'll take you to your Rosie. But where the girls is, I don't know, and that's the truth." Jim scrambled up onto the cart, slippery and sour-smelling with milk. The cook said something to the kitchen girl, lounging against the railings, and she ran down the steps into the kitchen. She came back up again with a small loaf in her hands. She passed it to Jim, laughing up at his surprise. It was still warm. He tried to thank the cook with a wink, but she turned away. "Don't you dare come back," she said. "There's nothing we could do for you." Her voice had gone thick in her throat. "God bless you, child, and I hope he takes care of you." And she hurried away without looking back at Jim. Jim spent the morning jolting from side to side in the cart, jumping down from time to time to help Betsy heave the horse over sticky heaps of snow. "There's my yard," Betsy grunted to him at one point, "and there's my cows. Hear them talking to each other, like old men in an alehouse they are, full of wind and wisdom. Now, this is where my right round finishes, but if Albert will let you, we'll carry on to the river." Jim jumped down again, and they both hauled on Albert's reins until they coaxed him past Betsy's yard and the mumbling of the cows. "Let's smell your bread, Jim," Betsy said. He had already nibbled the end of it and was keen to save the rest for his next few meals. Betsy reached out for it and took a huge bite, her loose teeth bending forward as she chewed it. "Poor old Rosie Trilling," she kept sighing in her breathy voice. "Poor old Rosie." They were coming near the river. Jim could smell it, and he could hear the gulls keening across it. The street they were in now was littered with the heads and spines of fish, and women sat on crates gossiping as they worked at their filleting. Their hands were slimy and red with fish entrails. Cats and children prowled around them. A dairywoman with her pails slung across her shoulders on a yoke trudged past them and shouted out something at Betsy. Betsy clicked at Albert to stop. "She'll be gutting me," she grunted, "if she thinks I'm selling milk on her patch. Up down, Jimmy, and ask someone where Rosie Trilling lives. Someone will know her." Jim slid down from the cart and watched lame Betsy coaxing her horse round and limping back along the street. "I could stay with her," he thought. "If I don't find Rosie, I can milk her cows for her and carry her pails. Surely she could give me a home." He started after her. "Betsy!" he called out, but she didn't hear him. She and the younger dairywoman were shouting at each other across the street, while the knock-kneed horse nosed into the muddy road and snorted at the fish heads. Jim ran down the side street. The houses backed into the river had boats in their yards. The spars and masts rocking gently, tinkling in the early breeze. Men were edging barges out, shouting across to each other, their voices bouncing off the buildings and echoing over the water. Some women were standing hands on hips watching them. Jim couldn't remember what Rosie looked like anymore. In his mind, he saw a big woman with floury hands and her hair neat under a white cap, a starched apron tied over a long black dress. There was no one here like that. The women he saw had drab shawls draped across their heads and shoulders, and wore coarse dresses with ragged hems. He listened to their voices, trying to pick out one that he recognised, but they all sounded the same. Pitched to shriek against the bustling noises of barges on the move and the screaming of gulls. At last he plucked up the courage to ask someone where Rosie Trilling lived. If she's in, he was told, she's at the white cottage at the bottom end. When he knocked on the door, a woman's voice shouted to him to come in, and he knew it was Rosie. And there she was, crouching over a fire that was glowing with hot coals coaxing flames out of it. She was holding a twisted wire with a glistening herring skewered to it. An old woman, wrapped in bundles of brown and grey shawls, huddled next to her in a chair that seemed to be made out of boxes roped together. Rosie was breaking bits off the bread of the herring and feeding the old woman with it. She looked up at Jim, surprised. The men are set off, son, she told him. Rosie, said Jim. His eyes stung from the smoke. He rubbed them with the back of his hands. Yes, I'm Rosie, she said. And I told you. I've come about Lizzie and Emily, he said. The smoke seemed to be in his throat now, twisted down the side of him. It was hard for him to breathe. I'm Jim Jarvis. Lord bless us. Rosie dropped the herring into the flames, where it spurted like a blue light, and the old woman swore at her. Annie's little boy. Rosie stared at him, her hand to her mouth. Jim nodded. He bit the back of his hand to try to make the stinging in his eyes go away. He could hardly see Rosie. Now she was a brown, blurred shape that was moving around the fire and coming towards him. She smelt of warmth and fish. She squatted down to his level, putting her hands in his shoulders. Ma died a long time ago, Jim began. Rosie pressed into her and ran her hands through his hair, hugging him as if he was a tiny child again. And for the very first time since Joseph had told him the terrible news, Jim let out all the hurt that had been locked up inside him and cried for his mother. I'll do chapter 11 in a moment because my daughter's just come upstairs.